Hello and welcome to this video on the bane of health food nuts, high fructose corn syrup, and just what this supposed blighted evil of the health industry is. Let's start with addressing the elephant in the room of just what this seemingly chemically sounding chemical actually is. In short, high fructose corn syrup is a sweetener, and that's how we'll refer to it from here, as calling it high fructose corn syrup every time will not just be frustrating but repetitive, and voice destroying. Now we have a name and a purpose, or at least the primary purpose, that being to sweeten things. Our sweetener is made up of fructose and glucose derived from cornstarch. In fact, in America, a ridiculous proportion of corn is used for exactly this purpose. That's somewhere around a third of all corn being fed into this role. Despite being a seemingly innocuous product, this sweetener was developed something of a public relations problem. Not on the level of Hillary Clinton as a byword for warmongering, but not far off in terms of its adverse effects and lack of public appeal, or at least supposed lack of public appeal and supposed adverse effects. Let's begin with how you get high fructose corn syrup in the first place. The sweetener production process is relatively straightforward. You begin with, surprisingly, corn. The corn is milled to a flour-like state, otherwise known as a cornstarch, and then a acid-active enzyme is added to this. The acidification helps not only to facilitate the enzyme's activity, but it further breaks down the bonds of the starch. The starch being a very long and highly branched chain made up of much smaller units, in this case typically glucose. As you add acid and heat up the vat, the enzymes begin to activate further, and this active enzyme metabolizes or converts the starch and the broken up parts of it within it into fructose. Now, the fructose itself isn't necessarily helpful straight away, mostly because it can't really work as it is. You need alpha amylases to break down those long chains, and that's one of those acid enzymes that's added at the start. So you really have to look at this as a series of steps. You start with your amylase, or specifically the alpha amylase, which breaks down the long starch chain into shorter sugar chains. Then you have glucoamylases, which help to free up the glucose. And then you have your glucoamylases also convert a significant portion of that glucose into fructose. The end result is filtered, and it's passed over activated carbon. This should lead you to a solution that then will be passed over something called xylose isomerase. Now, the xylose isomerase helps to further ensure that you're getting mostly glucose converted into fructose. Understand, when we say mostly, there's a big caveat we'll get to in due course. But this should leave you with a fairly pure product. Now, the most common product made from this is actually 42% fructose, so it's not actually completely fructose. There is some leeway in exactly how much fructose is generated. Roughly half the glucose that goes into this process will come out the other end. So you have somewhere between 50 and 52% glucose, 42% fructose, and a variety of unconverted starch and various other products that make up the remainder. This is your high fructose corn syrup. Now, as far as the actual availability goes, there are different versions out there. You have approximately 24% water, up to a 5% that's glucose that's conjoined with other things. Most of the time it's going to be other glucose. And then you have the glucose itself and the fructose itself. Each of the products is typically labeled as HFCS and then a number. Now, this number tells you what percentage of this is fructose. So HFCS 42 is 42% high fructose corn syrup, therefore 42% of it is fructose. If you look at others like 55 and 70, it's exactly the same process. 55% fructose and 70% fructose respectively. Understand, in terms of what's being used most often, the 42 or HFCS 42 is the most common by far and away. However, HFCS 55 is also used, although this is almost only used in soft drinks or soda, pop, whatever you happen to call it. HFCS 70 is almost only used in lollies or confectionaries in the form of a jelly. This should tell you something about what it is, and particularly how common it is, given that you have a variety of formats, and that it's, a large percentage of corn in America is put into this process. This does lead to some issues though, and one of these is that high fructose corn syrup, or this sweetener, is commonly misattributed to being the same thing as corn syrup. Now, these are very different products. Understand they are both very similar in what they are, that is, most of them are made up of glucose, but high fructose corn syrup has both glucose and fructose. This is an important caveat. There's also some differences in the nature of the glucose within this. Mostly that, in terms of corn syrup, a lot of the time the glucose is part of relatively short chains, typically about 10 residues in length. The other thing to be aware of is that it's also often confused with pure fructose, which is not really that surprising given the name. Understand, this is not a pure product, it is a mixture of glucose and fructose. And in short, the naming was probably not a great choice for a variety of reasons, not least of which is this confusion. But the naming seems to have derived primarily from the fact that it was being distinguished from pure glucose containing corn syrup. So it's probably more a relic of its time rather than any true failure in that respect. Okay, so we've gone through the chemistry and a lot of what it's not. Let's look at what it is now, or particularly what it's used for first, because this could perhaps be more important. In the European Union, it's not actually sold as high fructose corn syrup. It still does exactly the same thing. It's still a sweetener. But it's either sold as isoglucose or glucose fructose syrup, which, to be frank, is really just the same thing in a slightly more awkward naming convention. The difference is that there's slight distinctions in how much fructose is present. Typically in Europe, it's somewhere between 20 and 30%. In America, 42 and 55% variants are much more common. And this again has a lot to do with the nature of what's being used. So in America, the availability of corn is significantly higher. Further to that, a lot of corn production is subsidized and there's a lot of industry built around it. And not so much in Europe. In Japan, it's a different story again, although this is primarily in the terms of where it comes from. Most high fructose corn syrup in Japan is imported from the USA. And as a result, there's a lot of limitations put on it with regards to how it can be used and, more importantly, how much can be used. Now, the most recent numbers we have say that high fructose corn syrup is about 30% of the Japanese sweetener market, which is not actually that bad. But then again, this applies to things like food, drinks, cakes, and so on. It's everything. It's not just sweetener as an individual topic. It applies to a lot of different things. In America, we've actually seen a decline in the use of high fructose corn syrup. Now, this could in part be in response to the whole health nut debacle, that is various claims about its suitability, health, dangers, so on and so forth. And there's been a drop in somewhere in the rough range of about 50% decrease in consumption. That is, since roughly the 90s, the amount of high fructose corn syrup per person has decreased by about half. Although the domestic consumption in America has gone down, exports have only gone down by about 20%. And of that reduction in export, it's mostly been in places like Mexico. And this is again due to things around taxation and other issues with how governments in other countries handle the import and export of various sweeteners. And now this brings us to, the variety of health claims around the sweetener. To be clear about it, high fructose corn syrup is roughly 75% or 3/4 carbohydrates, that is your fructose and glucose, and depending on formulations, the exact ratios will vary. The remaining quarter is primarily water. This means that if you were to take a 100 gram sample out of this, you would have 25 grams of water and 75 grams of basically sugars. In that 100 gram sample, you would be able to get roughly 280 calories. This has led to be blunt about this, partially false claims that there's actually more fructose in this than there is in something like sucrose. That's not necessarily true. A high fructose corn syrup varies between roughly equal, just over, and a little bit less fructose as a percentage than, well, regular sugar, that is table sugar or sucrose. There is a range between 42 and 70% fructose. At 42% fructose, which is pretty much the most common for food and beverages, at least in the USA, you actually have less fructose because it's 42% versus the 58%, unsurprisingly, and as such, you actually have less fructose because in sucrose or table sugar, you have a 1-to-1 ratio. In the roughly 50 to 55%, which is the next most common concentration of fructose, yes, there is a little bit more, but we're more or less operating on somewhere between a 1-to-1 ratio or a 0.7-to-1 ratio, which favors glucose. This means that you either have a 1-to-1 ratio, which is basically the same as sucrose, or you have even less fructose, and in this case it's the 0.7-to-1 favoring glucose ratio, and therefore it's theoretically healthier than sucrose if that argument was to be taken at its face value. Admittedly, in sweetened beverages like soft drink, energy drinks, soda, pop, whatever you wish to call it, it does become skewed the other way. There is typically more fructose than there is glucose, but the differences are relatively insignificant. The key here is that none of these things that have high fructose corn syrup added to them are meant to be daily consumer items. This means that even with the highest end, that being 70% fructose versions, it's meant to be used in jellies, a lolly or confectionery, which are not meant to be daily dietary intake items. They should be regular treat items, assuming you're following a relatively healthy diet. And of course, there's the other issue here, which is, well, as we mentioned, the typical ratio is going to be pretty much the same as, say, sucrose or inverted sugar, and even honey. You know, one of those things that health nuts go on about as being a perfect example of what is good for you. Being vomit that's good for you. It's just the same as far as the actual content goes, or at least the ratio of content. Then there are claims around the role that it has to play in metabolic syndrome. Now, the problem here is that there is a limited body of anecdotal evidence and case studies, but these don't necessarily mean a lot because all of the larger scale attempts to actually show evidence of or be able to figure out what's going on that might be causing metabolic syndrome haven't been able to find it. The evidence has at best been weak and oftentimes heavily biased, so there are problems there. And admittedly, the same issues occur around liver diseases, enzyme levels, and fat content. So, yeah. The next one has to do with absorption of it. Now, there's been an argument that, well, fructose is more easily absorbed, and actually, kind of no. There's an issue around the way fructose is absorbed in the particularly small intestine, and the thing here is that without glucose alongside it, it's simply not able to be absorbed properly through the various transporters within the small intestine. This means that you don't have the ability to effectively absorb it without the corresponding glucose present, and that is pretty much why high fructose corn syrup has to have both things, at least to some extent. There is in fact a slight irony in this, in that sucrose itself is in a similar boat. The difference is that because of the way sucrose, that is table sugar, works, it's broken down via hydrolysis. That is, once you expose sugar to water, it separates into glucose and fructose. And because of this, both of these can be transported through the small intestine. Now, it's important to note that fructose goes through the GLUT5 transporter, whereas glucose goes through a different set of GLUT transporters. One of the things that has contributed to the major problems around both studies into this and claims of its ill health is that it is a fairly high calorie or calorie concentrated product. And of course, a lot of the time, calorie concentrated products tend to be, well, to be blunt about this, disproportionately used by those who are obese, those who are poor, or those who are uneducated. And because of that, they tend to not have the greatest health in the first place. Because of that, the same people tend to either, because of obesity and their use of high calorie concentrated foods, those who are poor, consuming foods that are high calorie but not necessarily nutritious, and those who are not necessarily educated, not having a great diet, tend to be ill health, but also not have that good diet, and because of that, health issues are far more common. In fact, a lot of these same foods that have a high calorie concentration, for example, soft drinks, soda pop, etc., all of these tend to have fat added to them as well, which adds to issues around things like obesity and other health issues. Therefore, the biggest guide here is not necessarily that high fructose corn syrup based beverages, foods, etc. are themselves unhealthy. The excessive consumption of them is unhealthy, which isn't all that surprising. In fact, studies looking at the idea of reducing intake of, say, sugary beverages, particularly those that have high fructose corn syrup in them, did in fact have a beneficial effect on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is a fancy way of saying your liver gets better if you stop consuming so much soft drink. There are also some claims around the sweetener in this instance related to beekeeping. Now, it is true that high fructose corn syrup can be used as a substitute for bees when they are either short on honey or there are issues around a low nectar supply. This could, for example, be due to a very late spring start when flowers aren't coming out, when there is an exceptionally cold winter, and this causes the bees to go through their honey that much quicker, when there are issues around the hive management and so on. What is important here is that the claim is that high fructose corn syrup is bad for bees, and no, not exactly. It's true that it is used and it is effective, but if you heat it up to above 45 degrees Celsius, which is about 110 freedom units, you can produce toxic products within high fructose corn syrup. But then again, if the hive is getting above 45 degrees Celsius, the bees are already in trouble. So this is something of a separate issue, and it doesn't necessarily contribute to colony collapse. In fact, if you are in a situation where you have to worry about heat that is that high, and you're having to also feed them external sugars like high fructose corn syrup, it's only one of multiple factors that will be contributing to the colony collapsing, because things have hit the fan long before now and things are going worse. And more than that, well, you get similar genetic changes in bees whether you feed them regular sucrose, that is table sugar, or high fructose corn syrup. The only difference being that high fructose corn syrup, typically speaking, is slightly less rich in nutrients, which again isn't all that surprising. It's just corn sugar. It's literally cornstarch that's been purified to be just sugar. Whereas table sugar or sucrose tends to be a little more complex, particularly if you're not using a pure white sugar variant. Despite all of the, let's say, furor over it from a health perspective, a apiary perspective, and its fairly universal usage, it's not always preferred, and to an extent it's for a good reason. It does have a different taste in some circumstances. For example, Coca-Cola made in Mexico is typically made using sucrose rather than high fructose corn syrup, with some exceptions, and as such it does have a notably different taste. It's one reason why Mexican manufactured and then imported Coca-Cola is sometimes preferred. Now, this can sometimes be misattributed to whether or not it's come in a bottle or a can, or whether or not it's purely an ethnic preference and so on, but just understand that it does have an effect on the flavor of things like drinks. There are, however, solid reasons why high fructose corn syrup is used. It is nearly always cheaper, and this even accounts for things like increased taxes in some countries where there are issues around the importation or exportation of sugar, that's sucrose, or high fructose corn syrup alternatives to standard sucrose. It does provide greater sweetness for its weight. That is, you can add more, or more accurately, you can add less high fructose corn syrup but get more sweetness out of it. The availability is also somewhat more stable. Now, understand this is primarily derived from the fact that America produces a lot of corn, and can as a result convert a lot of corn into this, or into ethanol. It's also often less taxed, and this is an important caveat. Things like cane sugar-derived sugars, or sucrose, tend to be taxed more than things like high fructose corn syrup in a lot of countries, and there are various governmental reasons for this. Another reason why it's preferred is that, as we've mentioned, there are no established health issues. Understand, anecdotal evidence and theories are all great, but you need something to support them more than just the anecdotes. And the plural of anecdotes is not data. It is arguably conspiracy theory. And finally, it is functionally very similar to sucrose, or regular table sugar, and this is why it's preferred, at least in some capacity. You get all of the benefits without all of the hassle associated with sucrose. Of course, said earlier, not always or by all people is it preferred. Its taste is somewhat different. It is somewhat more of a black horse in that it has a reputation for being unhealthy, but it's an unwarranted reputation. Despite this, people will go out of their way to avoid it. The same issue does, however, blend into not only the where, but why and how it is used. Most applications of high fructose corn syrup are in situations where food is already not nutritious. It should not be consumed regularly, or is a very low-cost food, whilst also being very high in calories. That leads to whatever it's being used as part of, and particularly in terms of dietary intake, being consumed by those who are not really in possession of a good diet and lifestyle, whether that is due to financial, cultural, behavioral reasons, and that the same food that's being consumed regularly should not be regularly consumed, which would be contributing to the association of high fructose corn syrup with various adverse health effects, and to a lesser extent, the observed health effects, for example, liver disease. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.